Good afternoon, I suppose. It's the afternoon. I'm Jeffrey Lewis. I'm the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Non-Proliferation Initiative here at the New America Foundation. For those of you who haven't visited us before, the Nuclear Strategy Initiative is a bipartisan effort to draft policy guidance for the next president on U.S. nuclear weapons policy. And so that naturally raises questions about how much is enough in terms of nuclear weapons for deterrence. And so we are particularly honored to make some progress toward that question today with Professors Keir, Lieber, and Daryl Press. I first was introduced to these two when Professor Lieber called me to ask a few questions about the Chinese nuclear arsenal, and I, as someone who has suggested that their posture is manifestly in the interest of the United States because it's so far off alert, I thought I had won a convert to my view. But they have now published a trio of remarkable and controversial and interesting articles that make a very profound and important point. Whereas I thought we were heading into an era of stability because countries were less concerned about survivability, they have suggested that the United States is entering into an era of nuclear primacy, the we can take 'em school. Now, I don't know that they've been that prescriptive. They have had a series, as I say, of articles that have been just extremely interesting and have really delved into what is a lost art of modeling these kinds of conflicts. I mean, I think whereas I had some vague notions about survivability and vulnerability, they've actually put some hard numbers in what I think is some of the most rigorous and compelling thinking about these problems. This is, I think, the first time that they have appeared in Washington, and so it is good to get them down here because I think we're going to have a vociferous debate. I'm extremely interested to see what kind of questions they get. I think I got a taste of this at a conference we were all at earlier, and so I think you all are going to be extremely engaged and very interesting. So now, are you guys going to split this in half, and are we going to start with Professor Lieber?
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Sure. Thanks for having us here. I guess with that introduction, I should say that if you came to hear us make the same arguments we've made in either our Foreign Affairs piece, International Security piece, or the Atlantic Monthly piece, which is the third article, which there are copies of the magazine out there last summer. You're not going to get exactly that. Of course, we hope to be provocative, but we're moving on. And what you'll see is that this talk, How Much Is Enough, is part of a larger book project that we've embarked on, and is really driven by the question of to what extent does the nuclear balance, the strategic nuclear balance, matter anymore? Because there are still lots of skeptics out there, as we found out in publishing our work, about a dramatic change in the strategic nuclear balance and equation. And so I'll get right down to it, our talk, but we have a number of different things going on. I think, I hope that many of you will be interested in them. The title of the talk is How Much Is Enough? Deterrence Theory and Chinese-U.S. Nuclear Relations. The motivating question, first of all, we are starting with the premise, which should not be that controversial here in Washington, although it often is elsewhere, that China and the U.S. may be headed toward a serious rivalry. There are grounds for optimism, of course, but there are any number of major lines of argument or theories that suggest trouble ahead. We look back at history, we don't see many cases of great powers rising and other great powers declining in relative terms that hasn't led to trouble in some sense. If you're a believer in democratic peace theory, which many of our academic colleagues are, there are not necessarily grounds for being optimistic here, leaving aside how democratic China really is. If it's going through a process of democratization, many have pointed to ways in which trouble, war, conflict are more likely. And again, you can look at multilateral institutions in Asia, how strong are these? We just want to make the point that it's a reasonable assumption that there could be trouble ahead in the U.S. China relations. That leads to the motivating question of whether or not nuclear weapons will have a stabilizing effect. How big, how survivable must China's arsenal be for robust nuclear deterrence to hold? And that's part of the larger question of, general question of how large and survivable must a nuclear arsenal be to prevent nuclear attack, for deterrence to hold. The next obvious question is, haven't we done this before, right? For those of you that were around during the Cold War and have been in a library recently, we've got, forests have been felled, oceans of ink have been devoted to this issue. What's going on here? We may look young, at least I may look young, but we're well aware of these studies. The point we want to make is that these Cold War studies are deeply flawed. And they're mainly flawed because of the way that they've conceptualized, measured the independent variable of the nuclear balance. And oftentimes it is most equated with the numerical balance. This is bean counting. This is old studies that said, oh, look, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets had more of X, Y, and Z. Therefore, they had the advantage. Other studies have flipped it around exactly. And in general, we've had kind of bad data on force size. And this is just simply mainly a function of what is available, open source data, what's been declassified. When you look at the dependent variable, the situation is even worse. Scholars were looking, and analysts were looking at the right categories, strategic posture, crisis behavior, but they were relying on memoirs, interviews, official statements, all of which were questionable in terms of their utility for really understanding what was going on. The example that we have up here is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you get the canonical accounts. We stood eye to eye with the Soviets and they blinked, right? And then we come to find out that Kennedy is making deals about the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, et cetera. This is not exactly reliable evidence, as if memoirs sometimes can be useful in interviews and statements, but the extent to which those studies relied on that kind of material gives us good reason to question them. Good data really only began to trickle out in the 80s as you got declassified materials from that early Cold War period. Another question to ask is, why does this matter today? Fine, we understand maybe it matters in the past. We are going to come back to this later on in the talk. Daryl will return to exactly this slide and a couple others. All I want to establish right here is that the Chinese silo-based nuclear arsenal, its nuclear deterrent, is highly vulnerable to a U.S. first strike. Okay? This is a calculation of the probability of destroying all 21, 18, 19 silos. If you use SLBMs, you're talking 96% probability of destroying all of them with a first strike. The key question, if you agree with this, that it's a vulnerable arsenal, is how pacifying can it be? Again, how maybe that's still enough to provide a deterrent kind of relationship between the United States and China. Again, we'll come back to China in a moment. Today's talk actually stems from this larger book project, and this is for those that might be interested in where we're headed and what we're going to do. Today's talk is really about the second and third chapters. So I'm going to lay out 4 different theories of nuclear deterrence, the 4 main schools of thought about how much is enough to deter. And then we will look at how the nuclear balance affected strategic posture during the Cold War. Later on in the book, we talk about the impact of that independent variable of the nuclear balance on crisis behavior. We consider the role of the nuclear taboo. We talk about arms racing, bureaucratic politics driving nuclear the arms race, et cetera. Okay, this is an important point. How do we know if a country's nuclear arsenal is deterring? How do we know that it's doing the work that it's supposed to be doing? What we look at, the key independent variable, is its adversary's strategic posture. In the old days, when you wanted to understand the effects of the nuclear balance on deterrence, you thought of it as most times war or no war. And of course, that's a pretty blunt indicator of deterrence. This is a non-event throughout the entire Cold War period. What we try to do is tease out 3 different indicators of strategic posture. We're going to look at how the Russian arsenal, in this case, how the Chinese arsenal would affect U.S. strategic posture in 3 different ways. First, overall defense concept, which is the mix of how do we mix our conventional and nuclear options into our war plans. Second, about escalatory triggers. What's the threshold, the timing of going nuclear? We look at the targets in the U.S. strategic posture. Mainly, this is about the willingness to target or try to avoid urban areas. The main intuition here, again, we're so used to thinking about how much is enough from our own terms. How big should the U.S. arsenal be to deter the Soviet Union? How big should the U.S. Israeli arsenal be to deter Iran? The key question here is, as a country's nuclear force grows more powerful, its adversary's strategic posture should shift. So in this case, we're interested in how the U.S. strategic posture shifts as a potential adversary's posture grows. How large, how capable does it have to be to really cause a discernible and meaningful shift in that posture? 4 schools of deterrence. You can tell me later on which school you fall into and how I've mischaracterized you, but this is what our best attempt at looking at a large literature, and this is what we've come up with. First of all, view number 1, existential deterrence. Right? The insight here is that deterrence holds when retaliation is possible. Right? Once a country, for example, has detonated a nuclear device, it's not even clear that you have to have completely weaponized that nuclear bomb, is enough for deterrence to hold, to make another country change its strategic posture in a way which really downplays the likelihood of nuclear weapons, the willingness to go to escalate, to mix in nuclear options with conventional options. The obvious example here would be North Korea. The logic is you take a very small probability of retaliation and you multiply it by horrendous costs, and you're going to get robust deterrence. That's existential deterrence. Second view is minimum deterrence. Minimum deterrence contends that deterrence holds when retaliation is plausible. Okay, it's the notion that you need an assured retaliation. Certainty of retaliation makes no sense, but you also need more than just the minimal possibility of retaliation. You need more than the bomb in the basement capability to get deterrence. The key indicators of what a minimum deterrent arsenal looks like are delivery systems of appropriate range. If you don't have a missile that can deliver that nuclear device, then it's hard to see how retaliation is plausible. You have to see military training for retaliatory operations. How big of an arsenal does that mean? Well, small number, a few dozen. Again, the precise numbers depend on enemy counterforce capability, depend on survivability. We here argue that China today has a minimum deterrent force, which won't surprise Jeffrey. Again, I've just discussed the logic. Third view, assured retaliation, moving along the spectrum. This view holds that deterrence holds, when retaliation is assured. The indicators of this would be that you have not just delivery systems, a missile that's capable of delivering that weapon, but a diverse range of those systems. You have dispersed deployment of those systems. You really train for retaliatory strikes. What size is the arsenal? Again, it's tough to say. Several hundred warheads or more, some redundancy. Again, the key here is that you're really taking this business of retaliation seriously and engaging in that kind of endeavor. The logic is straightforward, right? To think about minimum deterrence, we're not talking about cautious leaders. We're talking about aggressive leaders who launch major wars, who take gambles, and therefore you need something more than just a minimal, plausible retaliation. Final view is assured retaliation, assured destruction, and I'm going to show you the final slide that captures all of these in a graph. According to assured destruction, deterrence holds when retaliation is assured and massive. Right? So it's not just going to happen, but you're going to lose more than a single city or a couple cities even. You need diverse delivery systems. You need dispersed deployment. Again, lots and lots of training. This is the Soviet and U.S. arsenal from 1970, the end of the Cold War. To deter gambling leaders. You need this capability. And when you look back at previous wars between great powers, it's not clear that great powers aren't willing to gamble in very high stakes crises on losing a city or two or three. And the idea behind this is you need the capability to utterly destroy an adversary to achieve deterrence. So this leads to our a graph that depicts these four schools of thought. Note the Rastafarian colors to, put us in to feel good about this, even though the topic is not so nice. And you get the basic idea. The two axes are the probability that an enemy can retaliate, moving from unlikely to very likely, and the cost of that retaliation, whether just a warhead gets through, a few warheads, many warheads. And I think this helps us represent where these different schools of thought are. You tell us which box you belong to. So the final slide I'll talk about is just to clarify what Daryl is going to talk about. Our independent variable in this study is the size and capability of Soviet nuclear forces, not bean counting, but relative to what the United States has and its ability to survive a U.S. first strike during the Cold War. The dependent variable is that strategic posture. How did America's strategic posture change as the Soviet arsenal grew? Right? We have this experiment from the past that we can look at and try and tease out some understanding for what might lie ahead in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. So I'm going to end it there and let Daryl take that part away.
Thanks, Keir. So what Keir just did is he just walked you through kind of a conceptual framework saying different people disagree, they have different intuitions about how much nuclear deterrent capability would be enough in order to get robust deterrence. What we're now going to do is walk you through a little bit of Cold War history and say, as the Soviet Union progressed through these different stages, how and when did U.S. strategic posture change? That's what we're going to do. Let me start by just taking one half step back and talking about the strategic situation so you can understand how U.S. posture changed. When I started looking at this period, my perception of the early 1950s and the late 1940s was a view that said that America was at the peak of its global power. Right? U.S. GDP as a fraction of global production was over 50% because of the destruction of World War II in Europe. And we had a nuclear monopoly, at least until 1949. So my image was this was America at its very peak, sitting on top of the world. It turns out that the reality from a military sense was very, very different. And this is based on declassified JCS documents, which we mostly got through a really great history by a guy named Ross of U.S. war plans in this period. But basically the story says, looking at the conventional situation, U.S. views, which slightly exaggerated but only slightly, U.S. views in the 1950s thought we were in dire straits after the war. Why was this? The U.S. had a grand total of 2 army divisions in Europe, and I think 10 more around the globe. I can't remember if that was 10 more or 10 total, but the answer is it doesn't matter. We credited the Soviet Union with about 135 divisions in Europe, which is probably a little bit too high, but nevertheless, that's what we credited them with. And we thought they had about an equal number of Allied divisions, although pretty suspect, and I left those off. The U.S. expectation, the JCS expectation of what would have happened in Europe had the Soviets tried to invade Europe from the period of about 1948 to about 1951 was they were going to run right through the continent, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. Our expectations was they'd be all the way through France and all the way through Western Europe to the Pyrenees themselves in 60 days, that they would seize Iran and Iraq for oil within 60 days, and that they would be to China and the Yellow River within China and to South Korea by 150 days. This was our expectation of the war plans. And the whole variety of war plans, and there were yearly updates to U.S. war plans, but the whole concept of U.S. operations of that period was as much of a fighting withdrawal as you could across the European continent, to literally do a fighting withdrawal at Dunkirk, again, this time our forces, to try to hold the English Channel to the Sea of Japan. That was the strategy. And then to conduct atomic operations at a deliberate pace and try to get back on the continent within about 2 years. This is stunning. Our war plan, the U.S. war plan, it's not one, it was the 3 consecutive war plans from about 48, 49, 50, from about 1948 to 1951, was our plan was to lose Europe. We thought there was no conceivable way of holding Europe, and it was to try to get as much force out as possible, and then basically lob nuclear weapons at the Russians while trying to slow them down and get back on the continent in a couple years. The nuclear balance was not much better. This was the period of U.S. nuclear monopoly, but it actually in reality wasn't so good. And I'm only going to summarize a few of the points here. The U.S. arsenal started out really small, 32 bombs in 47, and grew, as you can see, over the course of a couple of years. But our delivery systems were really primitive. We had no long-range bombers that could reach the Soviet Union from the continental United States. The initial operations were going to have to be medium-range bombers launched from the UK, from North Africa, from, I think at one point it was Okinawa, another point it was Hokkaido, but Japanese islands. But the strategic nuclear operation was going to be medium-range bombers who, by the way, would not have fighter planes who had the range that could support them. So we're talking about a handful of nuclear-capable bombers with a handful of very large, basically Hiroshima or Nagasaki-style bombs, flying at night without fighter escort over the Soviet Union, over terrain the pilots have never overflown. And by the way, the maps that SAC had in this period of time, these were Tsarist-era maps. They were just trying to find Russian cities in the dark over terrain they'd never overflown with Tsar-era maps. So this notion of profound U.S. nuclear primacy and boy did we have them covered, it's nonsense. It's also a little strange to think about, but if you think about the bombs of those period against a city, which is what the targets were in that period, a 20 kiloton bomb, which was the arsenal, has about 1 mile lethal radius, meaning it'll destroy basically everything within a mile of the bomb's detonation. SAC's accuracy, and this is the training accuracy, and everybody who knows anything about military operations knows that real accuracy is never as good as training accuracy. Lethal radius, 1 mile. Training accuracy, half the bombs fall within 1 mile. So the bomber's going to fly over a terrain they don't know without fighter escorts, and then they got a 50-50 chance of hitting the cities if they find them. This was not a position of U.S. power. This was a position of quite a lot of weakness. Now, how did the Soviet nuclear arsenal develop over this time and through the early 1960s? As most of you know, the Soviets tested their first bomb in 1949, and that's really the beginning of this period that Keir described, this period of existential deterrence. They have a bomb. They have a bomb, but they don't have any real military means of delivering against the United States. Maybe they could cobble something crazy together, a barge or something like this, but they didn't have any long-range bombers, nor did they have what we had, which was nearby allies, nearby the other guy, where they could stage easily. So they had no real military capability for delivering these bombs. The best they could do is use maybe some medium-range planes and tell the pilots or ask the pilots to fly one-way suicide missions. That was their deterrent capability against the United States. It's telling that they didn't even train for these missions. They were not flying pilots over the pole, which would have been the closest route. They weren't even flying reconnaissance routes over the pole to map out U.S. radar coverage or map out the route. They just didn't have a nuclear arsenal that was aimed at striking the United States at all, even once they got nuclear weapons. And this basically lasted till the mid-1950s, and U.S. leaders understood this. If you read the NIEs from the period that are now declassified, we were watching all the developments in these forces quite carefully. That started to change, though. By 1956, the Soviets deployed their first long-range bomber, which has at least the hypothetical ability to reach the United States. But there are few of them. And they still need to stage through these northern Soviet Arctic ice bases, basically ice bases, which were only accessible part of the year. It would have still been a hard mission, but they started to get a handful. I think the number there is 20 and 56. You can see the numbers growing. So they start to get bombers that can reach the United States. Toward the end of this period, they start getting a small number of submarines. I should point out those submarines patrolled only off of Europe, not the United States. But you look at this and you say, this is still a really vulnerable Soviet arsenal. A U.S. first strike would have hit the Arctic air bases first, would have hit the Soviet airfield second throughout the country, would have hit their sub bases and launched an intense ASW campaign against their subs, and we can talk more about that. But this is a minimum deterrence arsenal based on Keir's characterization. They have some military capability to hit the U.S., but it was not very survivable. Maybe it would have gotten one off, maybe not. This started to end about 1962, and again, these periods faded into each other. And what's the big change here? The big change here is the number of bombers goes up. They start to deploy ICBMs. Their ICBMs are not very reliable, but by 62 they have 38 of them. They start to develop more submarines, and their submarines start patrolling off an American coast. And by 1962, you could imagine on a really lucky day, maybe the U.S. finds all the submarines, and maybe you can find all the ICBMs on a good day. But it would have to be a very good day for the U.S. And the JCS assessments, they gave a 61 and 63 assessment where the most important quotes have been declassified. In 61, the JCS told Kennedy, we can still win a nuclear war against the Soviets if we go first, but we might get hit by a few in response. Now, you can decide if that's a win or not, but that's what they told him. 2 years later, they basically said, we can't win whether we go first or not. So this is the period that you've transitioned from minimal deterrence to assured retaliation. And that's where our history of the period starts. And here's, again, back to Keir's Rastafarian colors. basically is to say this is kind of how we code the nuclear balance this period. And as the graph kind of shows, there are not concrete dates. Like the U.S. nuclear first strike option ended on October 9th, 62. They faded into each other as the probabilities of retaliation increased after a U.S. first strike. Everyone kind of understand what we're saying? Okay, so the question is, all right, so that's what happened on the Soviet side. When did U.S. war plans reflect Soviet growing capabilities? And this is the ugliest slide we will show you today. It's horrible. And we thought we were going to redo it and make it better. We couldn't figure out how yet. We'll work on it. But the key thing is this. What was U.S. nuclear war plans from 1947 to 14-9? And not just nuclear war plans, but war plans in general. Our overall defense concept for defending Europe was a conventional retreat, a slow, deliberate atomic offensive. There was no need to go super fast. They didn't have nuclear weapons. We couldn't go fast. We had to move the bombers to North Africa, the bombers to Japan. And over the course of 30 days, we were hoping to try to hit 20 Soviet cities, whether we'd be able to or not. That was the war plan. Now, 1949 happens, and suddenly the Soviets have a nuclear arsenal. The existential deterrence school says, whoa, things are going to change. If not on a heartbeat very soon thereafter, the whole notion of waging nuclear war against a nuclear armed power, small probabilities of horrendous events, we're not going to be doing that. Turns out, totally wrong. U.S. war plans did change when the Soviets got nuclear weapons, but the first thing to get prioritized was the thing that had to come first in any U.S. operation in Europe was a U.S. atomic operation. It could no longer be deliberate, it had to be rapid. And the most important thing is a new target set got elevated above cities, which was the first priority was nuclear targets. So the Soviets get nuclear weapons, and we don't say, oh, forget nuclear war. We say, we've got to go fast, and we have to hit their nuclear targets. And that was U.S. nuclear policy basically through the 1960s. And this just kind of gives you a sense of what the targets looked like in 1955. There were 670 targets in the Sino-Soviet bloc associated with Soviet nuclear forces, 118 cities, and then a handful of battlefield targets, so not that many of them. What's interesting is you could see from 57 to 59, the Eisenhower administration at the highest levels, the president himself, his national security advisors, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, had repeated National Security Council meetings where they debated and discussed and fretted about U.S. war plans. And what they said over and over and over again is they said, the current strategy seems okay for now, but we're headed into trouble. And we're headed into trouble because a period is coming soon in which if we launch a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, they'll retaliate and destroy us. And what kind of a strategy is that for defending Europe or defending anything? And they debated this and debated this and debated this, and they just couldn't come up with a solution they liked better, and they basically kicked it to the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration comes in, the war plan looks the same, basically just bigger numbers. And it wasn't until about 1962 the Kennedy administration starts a review and basically says, for the same reasons, because the Soviets are developing an ability to retaliate, we need a new way of fighting. And the new way of fighting was kind of, we don't know what we're going to do. The new way of fighting was to develop enhanced conventional forces more than before, to maintain nuclear options, but to replace the period where we had only one option, hit them with everything we had as quickly as we can, with lots of different options, no pre-commitment as to when we were going to escalate, options for different target sets that eventually had different what they would call withholds, and options to try to avoid cities, et cetera. It went from a period where we knew what we were going to do to what we did through the end of the Cold War where there was no pre-commitment to anything. And leaders just wanted options, 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 options. What does this tell us? What this tells us is, in this entire period of time, the existential deterrence period, the minimum deterrence period, the U.S. strategy was not, oh, dear God, we have to avoid escalation. The U.S. strategy was, we got to go first. We got to go as quickly as possible. We have to destroy their forces on the ground. And that this began to change. You could see all the fretting in here in the Eisenhower administration, reasonable fretting, I don't mean to disparage it, and it began to change as the Soviets began to develop a secure retaliatory force. After which, basically, we never had an answer to what the heck we do, because all the options looked terrible, and it was just a development of options, options, options. Okay. Let me just do a quick caveat here, which is we're not saying the nuclear balance, this shift that happened in 62, essentially, is the only thing that was affecting U.S. war plans in that period. Obviously, other things were around the margins, and it's almost comical in the way they were, but around the margins, U.S. values and norms were affecting U.S. nuclear war plans. Eisenhower initially, not Eisenhower, Truman, when he initially looked at the war plans, the guy who just previously ordered the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki said, I will not have this country rest its principal national security strategy on a strategy of obliterating cities. And then the Berlin crisis happened. He's like, all right, let's look at that strategy again. So you could see these norms restrain him a little bit, and then he's like, we need a plan. What's our plan? And you could see threads of this through the Eisenhower administration, through the Kennedy administration. That mattered a little bit. These two things are key, which is in this period, unlike today, in this period of the 1950s, the profoundly unfavorable conventional balance in Europe pushed us toward a nuclear strategy, which is what we had. And the economic consequences that we believed we'd face if we tried to build up that, rectify that conventional balance, pushed us toward a nuclear strategy. So the economic considerations of rectifying this conventional balance. Now note, you can see how nuclear weapons solve problems 2 or 3 for us, because it was a cheaper way to do this. But points 1 through 3 suggest why it is today the United States substantially underplays the importance of nuclear forces, that we do everything we can to avoid escalation. We want to fight all of our wars conventionally, not with nuclear weapons, because we no longer have this unfavorable conventional military balance. All right, so that was all leading to this kind of the broader book argument that basically says, we don't have many, many cases. We have a variety of indicators about this one case, this case that framed a lot of our thinking about nuclear weapons. And the case suggests that, at least in this case, an existential deterrence is not enough, or was not enough, to hold the U.S. at bay. In fact, even a minimal deterrent force was not enough to hold us at bay. We were still going to rely on nuclear weapons and escalate as quickly as possible. Let's apply this just a little bit to China. And I'll say here, this work is much more preliminary. We're just starting. But is China vulnerable today to U.S. counterforce strikes? I'm going to look very, very quickly at silos. I'm going to say one sentence about submarines. I'm going to show you about 4 slides on mobile missiles, okay? And then invite you to ask as many questions as you want. But this stuff is preliminary. This slide, I have to say, is not preliminary. We've worked on this a long time. And what this slide basically says is, what are the odds of destroying China's silo-based fixed force today with 2008 weapons, 2008 ICBMs and SLBMs? And for kicks, we also want to show, what did the United States derive from the Reagan buildup of strategic forces? So we just asked, what if the United States hadn't done this and we were still using the 1985 Minuteman missiles or the 1985 submarine-launched ballistic missiles to attack the same current target set? And the answer is, the growth in capabilities is staggering. With the 1985 U.S. force, there was basically no probability at all you could destroy a mere 21 targets. Almost no probability. Why is that? There's a bunch of stuff here. There's accuracy that we use. This is the old ICBMs, the new, the old submarines, the new. I've got a bunch of data here. I won't talk you through all of it. But the bottom line is this. People have often thought that the improvements were around the margins, that the probability of destroying a given target, if you were doing what targeters call a 4-on-1 strike, and we can talk about that too, with the old force was about 0.87 of a given target. And with the new ICBM, it's a 0.98. You might say, well, that's a nice improvement. Moving from 0.87 to 0.98, great, you made some improvement. What's the big deal? The big deal is if your question you're asking is not the probability of destroying a single target, but the probability of destroying all of them, meaning going 21 out of 21, 0.87 doesn't cut it. 0.87 to the 21st power, and that's giving the U.S. a variety of benefits of the doubt, is a very small number. And this is bigger, but not that big. The improvement on the submarines is even better. And so the bottom line is, point number 1 is, the current silo-based arsenal that China has is incredibly vulnerable. It's also not postured in a way that they would know an attack is underway, they could react quickly, but it's just, they could double or triple their ICBMs and it wouldn't make any difference from this. I'd be happy to talk in more detail about this. I was going to say something about submarines. All I'll say about submarines is ask us in the Q&A if you'd like. Submarines, probably in the long term, if they throw 20 years of engineering and money at the problem, they're smart people like we are, smart engineers like we are, they steal some of our secrets, they'll figure it out in the long run. But that's a very expensive business, and it's a very difficult business, and it'll take them a couple decades. ICBMs, this is the way they're mobile ICBMs, the way they're apparently going, and I think they're right. I think it's the way for them to go, and this will lead them to an assured retaliatory force, and maybe to an assured destruction force. However, it's not going to happen overnight. There's a new DoD report that says they might be deploying up to 10, I think less than 10 mobile ICBMs now that can reach the United States. But that's not, there's many steps that you have to go before you have a secure retaliatory force. First of all, historically, the rate of missile production has been really, really slow. So when they're going to have 25, is it going to be 2 years or is it going to be 12 years? And we have no idea. And if you project off the past, it suggests a long time. Second of all, for a mobile ICBM force, it has two two ways of operating. It's in garrison a good deal of the time when it's totally vulnerable, and then it spends some fraction of its time in the field, and that's when it's hard to find, et cetera. So at any given time, a large fraction of the force, in peacetime or in crisis, is in the garrison, and so those kind of don't count from a survivable force. The third thing is, so far what we've seen, based on their other mobile missiles, is the vast majority of their mobile missiles are deployed in mountainous areas in China, and also they appear, or the ones deployed so far have been road-bound. Now, maybe if there's a really, really, really flat and well-prepared dirt road, they could do this, but when you look at these vehicles, these are big, huge, heavy vehicles with not very big tires and not very big suspension, and if you frankly raise the suspension a lot, these are tippy, heavy things. So they seem to be road-bound, which substantially eases the search problem for the United States. Number four is they have to exercise this force if they think they're going to be able to disperse it and hide it in peacetime. But each time they exercise this and every day they operate gives us time and opportunities to try to characterize their opportunities, discover shelters they might be using, et cetera. And lastly is if they follow the Soviet model, they'll likely deploy in groups. I mean, people speculated groups of 3 for command and control and communication reasons, among others. So that will divide. So again, the things that you're looking for actually is probably between a third and a half that are deployed, and then if they're grouped in groups of 3s, now you're searching for a smaller target set yet. And so we just tried to do, and this is where we're just starting, some back of the envelope here. And I should clarify, if they build a large force of mobile ICBMs, I think that barring some technological breakthrough, that will be a highly survivable force. But we're basically saying they're going to have to build a sizable arsenal. Shoot, we forgot to get this. We got this link from somebody linked to your website. This picture that you linked to on the deployment of the DF-31s.
Oh, right.
I want to give credit to him. Sean O'Connor. Sean O'Connor here? No. I want to give credit to Sean O'Connor. This is
New Jersey.
Excellent. So this is he went through and found likely DF-31 launch sites, which are not the mobile ICBMs, not the DF-31As. But it's a good first approximation here. And as you can see, it's a mountainous place. And if you scroll down further, you can see the garrisons. But the big point is, number one, what are the big points here? Number one, as you would expect from these road mobile missiles, they're all very close to major roads. If you zoom in, you can see these are at least 2-lane concrete roads. But you know, they're dispersed over a fairly big area there. This is about 10 miles from there to there. So we just asked the question, suppose the United States has not yet developed, real-time continuous surveillance capabilities through UAVs. You're just relying on snapshot views, and you see this convoy of 3 TELs, very big trucks, with all their support equipment going down the road. How long do you have to react to that before the search area gets too big? So we assume that the TELs can move about 30 miles per hour, which I think is a little bit optimistic for their side, especially on this kind of terrain. We assume that we observe them on the road and we get no target update. You don't get a second look, even though you might with some other systems. Also, there are probably things the United States is doing to try to get us better target intelligence around garrison sites, but that's a different thing. And we assume that these TELs are destroyed at 4 pounds per square inch of overpressure. I've seen people talk about 2 to 3 likely to do it. 4 will utterly destroy residential structures, to give you an idea. And then we asked, how many strikes would you need in order to, again, you notice this guy in the middle, to basically make sure you've gotten him, or very, very likely. And so not to horrify you guys, but these are 4 PSI contours for submarine launch, the modern U.S. submarine launched ballistic missile. Accuracy for this kind of a strike is irrelevant because, again, we're talking about 8, if I'm getting it right, I can't remember now. Maybe it's a 3-mile radius and the accuracy is 90 meters. So maybe the circle will move from there to there. But basically, the circles are so big relative to the accuracy, it doesn't matter. I should also say, we picked the height of burst so that there'll be no fallout. Or I should say, no significant fallout. Probably nobody dies from fallout. If anybody are, on the roads in those areas, they will die, but there's no fallout. And the answer is, given, I guess the takeaway is this, given the slow speed of these missiles, the slow speed of the trucks, if you can develop a pretty prompt command and communication system between the locating the thing on the road and getting information to a submarine, 30 minutes, basically this is assuming a 30-minute response, which is slower than what we did in 1991 in terms of targeting Saddam's mobile missiles, where I think we had it down to, well, substantially smaller than that. Point being is, a small number of deployed missiles is probably not enough. If they've got 6 battalions of these in different parts of the country, things get really, really difficult. All right, I want to end. Our bottom line is China's still on the minimum deterrent side. It's got a totally vulnerable, obsolete. They should just throw away their ICBM force. It's basically no value with respect to the United States at all. It's just a target. And in fact, it's probably more dangerous than that because it's apparently unfueled and unarmed. And it might be a problem if they decide to fuel it or arm it in the midst of a crisis. They'd probably be better off just filling the holes with cement. But they're moving maybe away from minimum deterrence by deploying these mobile ICBMs. They're doing the right thing. They're being smart about this. But they're not there yet. And we just don't know. Is that 5 more years of Chinese work or 20 more years of Chinese work? It depends how quickly they build these. And we've seen data on all sides of this. Lastly, conclusions. Point number 1 is the whole Cold War experience. We can argue about the history, and I think we're on good ground there, but somebody can say that's only one data point. You know, maybe my grandfather, some of your fathers, were just much more bloodthirsty than we are. And those 1950s Americans, they were willing to go to nuclear war even if, you know, they took one back, and we're just not like that anymore. So maybe America in the 1950s and early 60s was just a much more bloodthirsty, casually, you know, accepting, casually inflicting place than we could ever be. That's possible. But from this one data point that we have about how America responded to nuclear threats of different sizes, the answer seems to be, geez, a minimum deterrent force, when the stakes were high, when the chips were down, a minimum deterrent force was not enough. We were willing to go much longer than that. China has only a minimum deterrent force today. What are the policy implications? As Jeffrey said, Keir and I usually like to stay out of this. We're not arguing for one force structure or another in this work. We're basically saying, you can take from this what you may. We want to tell you, we want you to take from this, the Chinese have a minimum deterrent force. It is not survivable, number 1. And number 2, the last time we were faced with a minimum deterrent force, that wasn't enough. What you want to do with that politically is up to you. You could be a dove and say, geez, the world will be a much safer place as soon as China actually develops a bunch of DF-31As. And we should tell them how vulnerable they are and encourage them to do this. And hell, if there's a warhead design they haven't stolen yet, give it to them. I don't know. Do something. Help them with solid fuel. And much more seriously, maybe it should be, if you're a dove, reduce U.S. counterforce capabilities. There are a variety of things you could do if that was your inclination to make it so that we had plenty of retaliatory deterrent capability, but much less counterforce. If you're a hawk, you should look at this differently and say, we don't know how things are going to develop with regard to China in the next decade. Maybe it'll be wonderful, maybe it won't. But the bottom line is they have nuclear weapons pointed at American cities, and if you find yourself in a war or a crisis, it might be helpful to have these capabilities. And if that's your view, then the answer should be more investment into sensors for real-time surveillance. You probably like this reliable replacement warhead because it might give you some new capabilities that they don't like to talk about too much, and also improve guidance systems. Again, the fact, what we're claiming as a fact is the Chinese arsenal is small. That wasn't enough to get the nuclear peace going the last time. And then what you want to do with that is up to you from a political standpoint. We'll take questions as long as you guys have them, or Jeffrey tells us to stop.
So we've got a, well, first of all, I want to say that was outstanding. I really, I appreciate the rigor with which you tackle the problem. Since we are kind of a full house, I think what we'll probably do is take questions in groups, and then we'll let Keir and Daryl divide them up. So do we have a microphone in the back there? So do you want to come take this one that would arguably be for me? And then, but I'm going to ask the first question, which to sort of go up to the 10,000-foot view, it's a very interesting point that instead of measuring the success of deterrence by the war or absence of war, and then having to rely on policymaker memoirs, which do suffer certain problems, as you outlined, it's a very powerful point to suggest that we should measure deterrence by whether or not an adversary's posture changes. But I'm a little concerned that blurs the line between, it makes it hard to detect what is a stable and an unstable deterrent balance. And so I'm tempted to say, and you tell me if this is fair or not, that you know deterrence is working if you have an arms race. I mean, that seems to be what or what one could take away, that, you know, if deterrence is working, then the other side is making changes in their posture, and then you have to make corresponding changes, and so you have this arms race. Is it possible to, using your model, demonstrate that deterrence is holding, but in a stable, non-arms race fashion? And that's to either of you.
I would tell them to wait for chapter 5, but
I'm not that patient.
Yeah, I'll try. I'd say again, we went so fast that we had to skip over these concepts too quickly. It's our fault. But I would say, you know, nuclear deterrence in the Cold War was trying to accomplish a whole variety of things, and some of them are frankly contradictory. That when stalemate gets created, that solves some problems, but it creates all new problems of extended deterrence and conventional deterrence and all these issues that analysts call stability and instability paradoxes, et cetera. Our point would be, from the standpoint of nuclear deterrence making the other side substantially less interested in initiating nuclear war if war comes, then the key indicator is not an arms race. The key indicator is is the U.S. basically deciding we better build up our conventional arsenal, maybe downgrading relatively the role of preemption in U.S. war plans, creating other options. But the key indicator is a variety of signs that the U.S. is moving way the heck back in terms of its willingness to initiate nuclear war should conventional war come. So it's not at all an arms race. In fact, in some administrations might say, now that we know we can't do it, we should cut weapons, but it doesn't have to be the case. But it's a change into a much greater reluctance to escalate from conventional to nuclear and a higher threshold for such escalation.
Yeah, I would just add to that a lot of this turns on the perceived benefits of nuclear primacy. And if you want to come up with a strategic story for the nuclear arms race in the Cold War, you say that the United States, you don't want to rely on bureaucratic politics or military organizations just wanting better weapons and more of them. You set forth the argument that they're seeking to escape from assured retaliation. I mean, we tend to lean towards that view, but again, this is something that is definitely down the road. We'll have to come back, a couple of years or next year.
Well, you will have that invitation.
Thanks.
So we'll start with Greg Tilman.
I was hoping to hear some explanation for Chinese thinking that made them so calm in the face of growing U.S. capability to take out their entire strategic deterrent. If one looks at their short-range ballistic missile capabilities and the developments in the last few years, we can see a spectacular increase in numbers, a very impressive ability both to produce ballistic missiles and to test systems and take measures that would defeat ballistic missile defenses. So clearly, and the Chinese are willing to spend a lot of money and energy doing this. So if I look at what they did sort of tactically in the Taiwan Straits and what they've done in the strategic level, I can only conclude that it was not important for them, or they were not sort of intimidated by the fact that their entire ballistic missile force, strategic ballistic missile force, was threatened with decapitation or whatever. What is the explanation? I mean, they're clearly not thinking the way we would think. Why is that?
Actually, can we take this one and then we'll do a little bunch, because that's, I want to focus on that for a second.
Oh, you want me to take this? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'll give one answer, and I'm sure Daryl will respond. We addressed this a little bit in the Atlantic Monthly piece, which says, say, if this is such a dramatic change in capabilities, why aren't the Chinese accelerating their deployment of submarines, mobile missiles? The response is that they're more immediate fish to fry, and there's no doubt about it. I mean, their most immediate threats. First of all, the Cold War came from the reason their nuclear arsenal developed as it did, shorter range systems, et cetera, was because they were deeply concerned about a Russian threat as well as a U.S. threat. And in terms of its immediate objectives, the Taiwan Straits crisis is something that looms much larger right now than a U.S. first strike on their arsenal. And most of their modernization efforts are aimed at bolstering their conventional capabilities to deal with that scenario. So they prioritize for sure, but it doesn't mean that the latter idea of taking the deterrence business seriously is not in their minds, and they're not going down that road as well.
Yeah, I kind of agree, I think, not surprisingly. I'd say that what's remarkable to me is kind of the disjunction between the weapon systems they created that are aimed at the Soviet Union versus the ones that are, then the Soviet Union, now Russia, and the ones that are aimed at us. And the ones that they then aimed at the Soviet Union, they today aim at Russia, have all these characteristics you'd expect, which is they are mobile, they hit some in caves, And so the DF-21s, and I think that are obviously mobile missiles, and the DF, I think 3s are the ones that they were kind of scooting in and out of caves. So they reflect this, and yet they didn't do that with regard to the United States until these DF-31As. So kind of point number one is it might reveal something about their prioritization of threats, and they saw the Soviets as much more threatening than even the Russians today. The second thing, and this is what Jeffrey was just saying a few minutes ago when we were talking beforehand, is we might be understating the technical difficulties, the technical hurdles associated with making reliable mobile ICBMs, and the number of steps you have to get to, right down from miniaturized warheads. The warheads have to be very small and very light if you're going to throw them as far as you like, let alone put multiple And so maybe the big threshold on that was the alleged theft of the W-88 design a few years ago. There's the compact boosters, solid fuel boosters. There's even the advanced, apparently they have problems with these advanced TELs, the trucks. And so the only reason I don't like this explanation is because then there's only two outcomes in the future for me. Outcome number one, as an analyst, outcome number one is the explanation is right. It was a technical hurdle, and therefore in 4 years we see 400 of these. And now I guess the period of vulnerability is gone. Or they still produce these at 1 or 2 a year, even though they're apparently overcoming these technical hurdles, in which case the interesting period of minimal deterrence stays open, but the explanation is wrong. But I think if you look at the difference in their behavior between their posture toward the Russians, which I see it as one based on increasing survivability given resource constraints, and the one with the U.S. where it doesn't seem to be concerned, I think that behavior is best explained by the technological difficulties of doing what we described.
Since I got dragged into this, I'll just put in a plug for my book, The Minimum Means of Reprisal, where I my answer to that question would be that the Chinese just don't think about deterrence this way, and that's a function of some ideological things that were rooted in Maoism and the bureaucratic structures that were put in place, and to some extent, I think, good judgment, because I tend to put myself somewhere between that existential and that minimum deterrence camp. We can, at some point, I want to have a discussion about what we think the proper object of deterrence is, but I want you all to participate in that. So we'll take a handful of questions, starting with Philippe, and then this fellow, and then we'll go into the back with Charles. Oh, we can do it that way too. Nope, that's totally fine.
Colonel Datta, Foreign Policy Association. As a matter of fact, it is excellent articulation of a war between China and America. China versus America, the deterrences. But I think it is slightly, its datedness is watered down, because there are many nuclear weapon states have come up, for and against, and in the eventuality of a war, or in case considering of future defense or offense, you have to take into consideration of the many nuclear weapon states like India, Pakistan. Who will it side with? And your articulation is watered down then.
Who will accept it?
So have you touched that factor in considering this China versus America? It will be very isolated.
Okay.
What do you think about this?
Great, and then we're going to go to Philippe Bleek and Charles Ferguson in the back, and then...
Hey, thanks. So I just want to push back a little bit on the dependent variable, and I like it, and it's creative. It's quite different from what other people have done, but I wonder whether it's incomplete right here. So you're basically arguing
Should
that
introduce yourself.
deterrence. Sorry, Philip Blake. I'm a PhD candidate at Georgetown. We've been corresponding by email. So you're basically arguing that deterrence isn't working because the U.S., in the eventuality of war, is planning for first strikes. And I just wonder, don't you also need to look at the other things that the U.S. is doing to make war more or less likely? And isn't deterrence working if the U.S. is also in other ways acting less provocatively or doing things that make war less likely, right? So it may be that in the extreme eventuality of war, of course they're planning for first strikes, and I think that shift that you observe is really interesting, but I still think to measure whether there's deterrence or not, you need to also be looking at the sort of the likelihood of war, the more traditional way.
And then we'll take one more from Charles, and then, well, you can jump the queue if you'd like.
Andrei Piankovsky, Hudson Institute, visiting fellow from Russia. And I am nuclear expert and happened to talk with our Chinese colleagues. So may I make a remark about first question? It was very important. I think Chinese think in the same terms of deterrence theory very clearly, and they are so quiet because they know that they have assured deterrence. Because this concept of minimal deterrence or assured deterrence is vacant qualitative, and it's dependent of, and it's historically dependent. Chinese knows very well. If you really did the scenario modeling of Chinese U.S. Nuclear conflict, well, you know the figures. What's important result of this scenario? The average number, mathematical expectancy of number of Chinese warheads hitting United States in retaliatory strike. It's certainly more than one. And Chinese know perfectly well that for modern American society, it's absolutely unacceptable damage. Maybe it was an acceptable damage in times of McNamara when he talked about 200 missiles. But from Chinese perspective, they are firmly, deeply in the same paradigm of mutual assured destruction where the Soviet Union and the United States used to be, and that's why they're so quiet.
Great, why don't we take those three and then,
Yeah, okay, I'll just take a quick cut. First, the idea that the Chinese minimal deterrent, is something revolutionary and different, which I don't think is what this argument suggests. It's that they believe that they have that they can survive a first strike, or that they have enough force to survive. The notion that it's impervious to the data is not something that I think Jeffrey or even I think Chinese nuclear analysts would argue. In other words, do you think China would care that our force in 1985 could only have a 6% chance of destroying those silos, but now it has a 96% chance?
They know that no American president will risk
okay.
one American citizen.
let's let
again,
them answer.
the point is,
They know you better than you know.
No, I'm familiar with the argument, which is why we need to then get into nuclear taboo issues and all sorts of things. But again, this idea that China's minimal deterrent, which should be explained, why is it that China didn't develop this robust force? And again, we have some ideas on this. But the idea that that's not based on, driven by the strategic balance, I'm not convinced by it. I'd have to be persuaded that it's completely impervious to changes in the nuclear balance. And if China's nuclear, I don't believe that Chinese nuclear strategists are ignoring U.S. capability. And if they're presented an analysis by their own analysts or by us or whoever that shows that their force is completely vulnerable to such a U.S. first strike, I think that's going to matter. And if you disagree, then we just have a different view about the nature of Chinese decision-making. They're certainly not adopting that view towards the conventional balance over Taiwan, right? You look at what they're building it for rational reasons based on the balance of conventional capabilities. Why should it be any different for at the nuclear realm?
Let me say something similar, but I'll say it Keir's nicer than I am. I always say things.
I thought you were going to say more diplomatic.
No, Keir's more diplomatic than I am.
I thought I was the bad guy.
Yeah, I'll be the bad guy. Which is, look, you might be right. The Chinese might believe that we know who America is. America's not the kind of country who would risk a single city or risk something terrible going on. Point number one from this whole presentation is they're certainly wrong about us historically. And they might not know this. Most people don't know what we just presented. But historically, we were the kind of country who would lose 1, 2, 3 cities when the stakes were high, when the risks were high. So you might be right. I'm with Keir. I think they're not quite as sanguine as you are, and I think that's why they're spending a lot of resources trying to figure out how to make DF-31As. But if you're right, they are sorely mistaken unless, and this is what I said in the talk, unless we have fundamentally changed as a nation in the past 45, 50 years. That is a possibility, but what I would point out to Chinese friends is that this country has a history of doing things in high-stakes wars which were inconceivable ethically prior to those wars. Who led the world at the League of Nations in talking about how horrible the intentional bombardment of civilians was, but that the Germans and the Japanese were doing against Britain and China? We led the world at this outrage and said, this is the proof that our enemies are barbarians, because we'd never do this. Of course, 4 years later, we're the masters of this. Why? Because the stakes were high, the costs were high, and we were scared. And what we ended up doing with our British friends to Germany, what we ended up doing to Japan, is something we found inconceivable before the war. So if you're right, that China is resting on a sense of assurance that they know us and that we wouldn't get into such a game, I'd say they ought to read our history. Not this history. They ought to read the history of this.
But this goes to Philippe's question, right?
Yep.
Philip's question, sorry, which is all about your independent variable, which is if our war plans say we're willing to lose 2 or 3 cities, can you reasonably infer from that that is in fact the decision the National Command Authority would make when the chips are down? Which is an interesting assertion, but one that I think we can have an interesting discussion about.
Yeah, there are a couple things on that, and then I wanted to get also to Philip or Philippe or
Philip.
Do you mind if we call you Philippe?
Yeah, sorry, that was...
Okay. There's a broader question about drawing inferences from war plans. War plans are papers that get created in the DoD and they get put on shelves. And especially on the topic of the use of nuclear weapons, if there's ever an issue where the civilians are not going to just say, well, just give me what you got, they're going to intervene, it's this. In the case of the 1950s, there is a powerful argument to say that the war plans were the policy. I mean, the real policy, the chips are down policy. And the evidence is, at the most senior, these war plans were created with a lot of civilian oversight at the most senior levels of the United States government, the president himself and his top advisors. B, several members of the president's cabinet kept coming to him and saying, don't you want a plan B, C, or D? Do you really want it to be the case that your only option for defending America's most important overseas interest is to push that button? And Eisenhower kept, let me hear the arguments. No, I'm okay with one plan. And so in that case, as opposed to the later Cold War period, the period where the President of the United States said, I only want one plan, I think it is an indication of that they had decided what they're going to do. The entire rest of the Cold War is the opposite for exactly your reason, which is people wanted plans. Why? Exactly your point. They didn't have a clue what they really do. All the options stunk.
Go
ahead.
I'll piggyback and then come right
Please.
back to you. Just the one example, it's just stating this another way, which is that the U.S. strategy in Europe in the 1950s, massive retaliation, right? That was the plan, right? We were going to go. We built the forces. Commanders had their orders, et cetera. It was going to include massive nuclear retaliation. It was not retaliation, obviously. It was massive initiation of nuclear war in response to a Soviet invasion of Europe. That was the plan. Were we convinced that we were not going to, that the Soviet Union had no possibility of getting a medium or long-range bomber through to strike a U.S. city? In fact, no military commanders were not providing those kinds of guarantees to the political leaders, and yet that was the strategy, and that was the plan that would have happened had the Red Army come through the Fulda Gap.
One last point was in response to the very first question. Actually, maybe he already left. Oh no, there you are. Yes, sir. About this isolating the United States. Would this be wildly unpopular around the world? Yes. Would it be initially maybe unpopular in the United States? Probably. I think, I don't want you to misinterpret this in a variety of ways. This is not how the United States wants to fight any of its future wars. I mean, all U.S. military planning that I've ever seen and from the modern era suggests that the number one strategic or operational goal in any war we might fight, a regional war, is to keep it conventional. And it's largely because, well, it's for a variety of reasons, but one of them being we believe we have conventional advantages over potential adversaries, most potential adversaries in most of the potential conflicts. My sense of the only sorts of times that we'd consider this would be when things have gone quite badly in wars and we see major escalation risks. And in those circumstances, that's when we stop caring so much that people might frown on this. And that's when so in the course of a high-intensity conflict over Taiwan, the United States and China are involved in substantial air war, U.S. attacks on the Chinese mainland against command and control and electricity sites and maybe short-range mobile missile shooters. Maybe China feels this is getting too close, that they might lose control over Taiwan or it might topple the Chinese Communist Party, and they decide to signal us that we're going too far by alerting some of these mobile DF-31As. That's the kind of circumstance where people start thinking about this. And in those circumstances, as opposed to run-of-the-mill politics, that's when people care a little bit less, I think, about how are we going to explain this to our friends abroad.
Let me ask the two of you about that taboo issue, because how do you disentangle those kinds of concerns from the deterrent effect? Because certainly during the Korean War, the Chinese made the argument quite explicitly that even though they had no capacity to deter us with nuclear weapons, our nuclear threats were essentially empty because of the international condemnation. And then once they had nuclear weapons, I think a significant aspect of their argument for no first use has been nobody can use these weapons first precisely because of these international factors, and so as a consequence, one can get by with something that looks like an existential deterrent. So if the country that is deterring conflates both retaliation and the sort of other costs that the attacker would experience, how do you handle that in this model?
Do you want to go first? Or?
Well, I'm not sure I'm getting the very last part of that, but on the taboo issue, again, aside from saying that's chapter 4, we'll come back in 6 months to give that one. I think the serious response is that you're focusing on what your assessment of what Chinese leaders think about what the United States
What they say.
What they say, okay, even one order more removed from.
Well, it's being
what-
precise.
Right.
What they say.
No, exactly. What they say for what their prediction is what the United States would do. So the one response is, well, look, neither you or I know exactly what they're saying behind closed doors and what's in their mind, and I could just say my hunch is that I don't really believe that they think the United States is restrained by the nuclear taboo, okay? But we can't, that conversation basically ends with a disagreement. What we can do is look back at what U.S. leaders have thought about nuclear war, how they've planned for it, how they consciously have dealt with the possibility of nuclear use. And it's a rich story, controversial. We're not saying we're definitely right. We are obviously much more skeptical about the power of the nuclear taboo in constraining the United States during the Cold War. And what often happens is nuclear taboo arguments get pushed off in history. Almost exactly in, I'm going to be a little snide here, almost exactly in accord with when the documents are declassified about how U.S. leaders were thinking about nuclear war. So it used to be that, Eisenhower, Truman were constrained, by the nuclear taboo. Look at their rhetorical remarks, their policy
memoirs.
statements, their memoirs. Gee, nobody's, why are they writing that in there? And then you get into some of the documents and you see, pounding the table, we're going to nuke the crap out of them, left, right, and up and down. And again, as documents are declassified now, we're continuously, the National Security Archive releasing documents that, keep showing through the Vietnam War, we're thinking about nuclear use and all the rest. And so I just think that there are good grounds to be skeptical of both the historical degree to which the United States has really allowed the nuclear taboo to sink in, and what the future might hold in a high-stakes crisis, right? In a conflict over Taiwan, in which we start to see the Chinese arsenal being fueled, being armed, and a leader is faced with the possibility of having to launch a nuclear attack, which, by the way, wouldn't necessarily result in millions of Chinese casualties, as we say in the Atlantic piece, right? The technology is allowing us to consider doing this in a way that would disarm all 21 silos with casualties in the hundreds. Again, even if you don't think American leaders are a bunch of monsters, that scenario should lead those that have faith in the nuclear taboo, I think, to think again.
Bill Burr may want to join that debate at a later date, but Charles Ferguson has been probably the most patient questioner in history. So.
Oh, not at all, Jeffrey. I really appreciate this. And first I want to start out thanking the two of you for really jump-starting a much-needed debate. And not only you, but the Wall Street Journal op-eds. But I found your 3 previous articles provocative in the best sense of the term, and I look forward to reading your book. I'm not so worried about deliberate use of nuclear weapons, the United States against China or China against the United States. I'm more worried about how, given that the U.S. now appears to have a first strike capability against China, does that affect a nuclear fuse? Does a nuclear fuse shorten, lengthen, stay the same? Will China now develop launch on warning capability, early warning systems, and will that lead us down the path to possible accidental nuclear war with China? So that's what I'm more worried about, the inadvertence, not actually advertent war. Thank you.
Let's do Walt Slocum, and then we'll just get,
A couple of observations. One is the argument about differential stakes. My great and good friend Shang Guangkai allegedly at least once said, we know you would not trade Taipei for Los Angeles or Los Angeles for Taipei. The second is I think you exaggerate the ease of locating mobile missiles once you get a real mobile missile, which complicates this barrage scenario. You didn't mention defenses, which are often advocated as a backup to a highly effective but less than perfect strike. And finally, I'm sorry, I got here late. Maybe you talked about it earlier. You didn't mention the development of theater nuclear weapons and that doctrinal effect during the 50s.
Yes, and then we'll let them answer, then we'll come forward.
Okay. Right. Diane Perlman, I'm a social scientist, study cycles of violence and nuclear proliferation. First of all, this is a very interesting study, but it represents a certain paradigm and worldview which has a lot of assumptions. Deterrence theory is a theory, and it holds up in some situations and can break down in others. According to Ralph K. White in Psychology and Prevention of Nuclear War, deterrence works best when it's accompanied by drastic tension reduction. And there's also another theory, which is spiral theory. I think we're in an age now where we can provoke, spiral dynamic. We have sort of a combination of deterrent dynamics and spiral dynamics and unintended consequences and the law of opposites. And one of the basic assumptions of this is that we control other behavior by threat and fear, rather than by assurances and security assurances, conflict transformation, and other kinds of possibilities. But I think your methodology is very interesting, and some of your data could possibly be extended to address other paradigms of thinking about de-escalation.
Okay, great. We'll tackle those, and then I see we have a few more in.
I'll just very quick, oh, sorry.
But no, take
Tackle
those,
that one.
and then we'll.
Okay. Look, in both our Atlantic, and all three of the articles that we published, well, first of all, in the Atlantic Monthly piece, we, in all three of the pieces, sorry, I'm trying to combine a couple of things here, effective nuclear primacy, the short fuse, missile defense, things like that. We've explored these issues. Remember, when we first wrote about this, we said, here's what we're seeing. Right? A dramatic change in the nuclear balance, the emergence of nuclear primacy.
Not everybody knows the OVE.
What's that? No, right. Our argument was that while we're focused on lots of other things, and everybody thought the old Cold Warriors, had gone on to other things, nobody's been noticing. I'm very simplifying very much here, but if you look at the decline of the Russian arsenal, I almost made your Freudian slip again. The Russian arsenal, the slow pace of modernization of the Chinese arsenal, and the dramatic improvements in the U.S. arsenal, what we've seen, what we now should be focusing on is this dramatic change in the strategic nuclear balance, where you see the emergence of U.S. nuclear primacy, meaning on paper the ability for the first time since late 1950s, early 1960s, for the United States to conduct a first strike against the second largest nuclear power, in this case Russia. Okay, why are we doing this? Well, don't go reading the Russian press transcripts or various attempts to assess our intentions. If you read the article itself, you'll see exactly why we did it. We think this is important going on, and we're not sure about what the consequences of this will be. There are some very good reasons to think that this might provoke some very worrisome reactions, both in Russia and in China, that we should all care about. The point is to provoke a discussion. And so therefore, we care very much about tension spiral theory, the kinds of reactions. Do we know how China is going to respond to this? No, of course not, but it's at least plausible it could lead to reactions that U.S. planners and policymakers may not be aware are going to be produced, including a short fuse accidental conflict. And again, in our writings, we've discussed very explicitly how the different ways in which the emergence of U.S. nuclear primacy could blow back. Now, there's also the hawk view, which you discuss and represent, which is, hey, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe nuclear primacy actually brings benefits. Doves don't want to talk about that. Hawks don't want us to talk about U.S. nuclear primacy because they don't want us standing up on the roof and proclaiming this great new capability. Doves don't want to talk about it because it justifies the topic itself, although plenty of people are here in the room, so it couldn't be all that bad. Well, enough.
A variety of responses. One is just along that line. When Keir and I wrote this foreign affairs piece, there was actually a DoD response in the next issue or two issues later. It basically said, the lead paragraph was basically we're wrong and crazy and stupid. But then if you're interested enough in this, go back and reread the actual text of the criticism of both. I think it was Flory, it was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for something, and Payne, who had been in a similar position previously. Read their text carefully. They claim we're wrong. We disagree with them about U.S. motivations for substantially enhancing counterforce. Now, we disagree with them about that. They basically say it's an accident from some variety of things. They never once say, go back and look, that we are wrong in our claims about the huge increases of U.S. counterforce and the kinds of missions we're talking about. Neither of them say it. And it's partly because I think what Keir just said a moment ago, which is they're quite pleased with those huge increases of counterforce. They just don't want to stand on a roof and kind of proclaim it. But just look, they never once say we're wrong in our calculations. And actually, I had the very nice experience of Keir and I were at a conference actually with Jeffrey in the Naval War College, and we sat next to somebody who's, I would say, I won't tell you his name, but I can't remember his name, so it's easy. But he was working at State at ACTA, I think, at the time, or no, State at DTRA at the time. And he said that at his office, people in his office were basically sent to redo our analysis and show we were wrong in terms of modeling sense, and they did the analysis and they saw we were right, and they killed that, and then just basically attacked, the motivations or our description of U.S. motivations, et cetera. But anyway, so it kind of confirms or it goes along with the lines of what Keir was saying about there are people who are strongly in favor of this, they just don't want to proclaim it. As for the questions we just got, theater weapons, we didn't say anything about theater weapons.
And defenses and conventionally armed.
So I think the surveillance, the counterforce weapons themselves, and the defenses are all part of whoever you are who asked the question.
It's Walt Slocum.
Oh yeah, excellent. Are exactly as you're suggesting, all part of the same system, which is any kind of preemptive capability or counterforce capability. You should, maximize your ability to find targets both in a strategic sense and a tactical sense. You should maximize, in the command and control, quickly, promptly locate and get the locations to the shooters. You should increase your accuracy. You should give yourself yield options, and then you should give yourself defenses for whatever you might miss. And I think that is one of the purposes. A guy at NMD, the office who now I'm blanking on.
MDA.
Said to me basically, he said, yes, we put our the interceptors in Alaska where they are because they're on the right trajectory to intercept a Korean missile, which does not exist. He said, can't blame us if it's on the same right trajectory to intercept the Chinese missiles. That's just geography. And he kind of smiled and winked. But anyway, this is all part of the same package.
But Walt, does that get to the crux of your question, actually?
Well, it does in a sense. I mean, first of all, it seems to me this issue is really about technology.
Yes, for now.
For now, it's a long time.
Yeah.
And the argument for defenses, and the argument why the Chinese may react to defenses, I'm an advocate of building defenses.
Yeah.
I also think you have to accept the fact that the Chinese, in their own interest, will hedge against the defenses, whether we build them or not.
Yep.
So in that sense.
Yep.
But my only point is that a modest defense coupled with, what did you say, a 90% kill probability against the 20 or so missiles. The defense is an important backup if you're interested in this.
Absolutely, and it was a claim that Keir and I made. Again, it was not a novel claim of ours. Many people around here have been making this claim that defense, frankly, defense as a defense doesn't make that much sense because there are always going to be enough, in most circumstances, enough reentry vehicles. You're going to have a heck of a time really defending yourself from nuclear attack. Defense as an offense, if you're thinking about substantially degrading the other guy's force by going first, now defense, even a highly imperfect defense, that reduces their retaliatory reentry vehicles from 2 to 1, that matters. From 1 to 0, that matters. So,
Also, if it has the effect of shaking their confidence in the minimum return.
yeah, I think.
It's all very well to say the Americans might not like the idea of only a 98% chance of destroying all of those weapons, but whether the Chinese would risk a lot for a 2% probability of being able to retaliate, they have a different impact on them.
There's one other piece of the puzzle none of us have said yet, which is there are kind of a few different things that you'd be throwing into this problem if you got yourself into a horrible, threatening crisis where people are brandishing nuclear weapons and against each other like a shooting war over Taiwan. One is what we just counterforce capabilities with some sort of an imperfect defense. And then the most important piece of the puzzle, the one none of us have said, is intra-war deterrence, which is none of these attacks are on populated Chinese areas. And furthermore, all of these attacks can probably be done in a way that by picking height of bursts does not create horrendous radioactive plumes across China.
It uses a very small part of the
That's right. And then what you let them know is, hey, look, we got ourselves in a nasty situation over Taiwan. Lots of Chinese have died. Lots of Americans have died. You then threatened us and alerted nuclear weapons, and we destroyed them. You could retaliate against Japan with shorter range things. You could retaliate against Seoul. You could do something. But this would be a really good time to stop because we haven't targeted any Chinese population areas. And that's, I think, the final piece of the various probabilities you're stacking up. It's counterforce, defense, and most important of all, intra-war deterrence that says you stand everything to lose by escalating at this point. We've already destroyed 98% of your offensive capabilities.
Hans, you had a question, and a fellow I just met the other night who, Clark, right? And Philip, did you have a follow-up? All right, so if there are no more, we'll just take those three, and then we'll let you all wrap up. So,
Hans
brevity.
Christensen, Federation of American Scientists. You've analyzed nuclear weapons, kill probabilities and all that stuff. Had you also tried to look at advanced conventional capability? I'm thinking especially now we're sort of somewhat transitioning toward global strike capabilities with conventional weapons, and also because of the new triad system or construct or what have you. I mentioned a while back to a military attaché from the Chinese embassy. How would you view a U.S. conventional attack, a global strike attack with conventional weapons on your nuclear forces? Would that nullify your no first use policy because it wasn't a nuclear attack? Or would you just say, to hell with it and we'll go? And he jumped up in his chair and he was like, absolutely not, absolutely not. There would be a nuclear attack. It would consider a nuclear attack. Have you met anybody thinking along these lines when you talk to the Chinese or others that are trying to figure out the dynamic between conventional offensive strategic target, if you will, and then their Chinese possible reactions?
And then Clark and Philip.
Thanks. My name is Clark Cully. I'm a fellow at the National Academies working for CSAC. Your historical overview kind of stopped at 64 and said things get complicated after that, but I think it would be really interesting to look not only at the escalation but the de-escalation and the history, you know, from 80 till now, and particularly the effectiveness of arms control negotiations in changing the force counterforce posture. And I was also wondering if you reverse your analysis as dependent and independent variables to look at the American point of view instead of the Russians as the independent variable. Do you get agreement between all your conclusions?
And then Philip, and then we'll let you two wrap up.
Thanks. So I think I didn't do a very good job of phrasing my question, so I just wanted to take another crack at it. Because what I was trying to get at is not a disjuncture between planners and decision makers. What I was trying to get at, let me just be concrete. So Eisenhower is planning to do nuclear first strikes to take out Soviet forces. I think you've made that point well. But what I'm wondering is, might one not plausibly say that Soviet forces, short of assured retaliation, might also not have cautioned Eisenhower in a whole other slew of ways to not take steps that took the two sides down a path towards war? And I sort of think that's what we mean when we use the word deterrence. And maybe I'm acting as though your conclusion is stronger than you mean it to be. But it seems to me then the story is much more nuanced. At very high levels, when we have full-blown war, we're really worried about this first strike nuclear exchange. But at lower levels, there may actually be quite substantial deterrence, even with relatively weak forces of the sort that China has.
Three good questions. You can go now.
Let me just say one thing. It's not the point I would normally want to end on, just in terms of conventional strikes. I mean, there's no doubt when we were, even back in the day, attempting to model a U.S. first strike, where you put on your hat and you say, how would you do this, right, and do this most effectively. I kept harassing Daryl saying, why are we ignoring all these great conventional options that we have? And he convinced me that there was some utility in just focusing on this. I would start talking about a global strike, and I think he was right, and I was wrong to keep hassling him. He kept telling me we'll do that eventually, but we haven't gotten there yet. And the main reason is that because we didn't want to make an argument about what we're going to do in the near future even. We want to make an argument about right now. What are the capabilities that we have? And so we were very careful to distinguish what improvements had already been made in the U.S. nuclear arsenal from those that were already in the pipeline and coming. And so part of it is that we didn't have as good of an understanding of exactly, what you could accomplish, but we make the point that this is a very conservative kind of strike that we would model both against, earlier against Russia and against China. We have no doubt that those that are paid much more money than us in the government, I say only half tongue-in-cheek, government salaries, but are coming up with much better ways to carry out this kind of strike. We have not, or at least I have not thought much about the likely retaliatory response based on whether it's a conventional or a nuclear attack. I would not at all be surprised. When you said he rose up out of his seat, if you had said, of course we wouldn't strike back with nukes, I would have been surprised. I'm not at all surprised by his reaction to that.
A couple reactions real quickly. You're right, we didn't look at all yet at conventional capabilities, and this is one of the ways in which, frankly, I think all the things we've been doing, but particularly against China, have vastly been understating U.S. counterforce capabilities. And because I think there are a whole variety of things we could do at a conventional level to destroy most of these targets. I don't think it would work well. I mean, look, we tried this kind of thing against mobile missiles with conventional weapons twice, and we did nothing. I think for mobile missiles deployed in the field, you need to get large area effects. But for most of these targets, conventional will work just fine, and this is why we're dramatically understating U.S. capabilities. The way I understand, I'm trying to, like you, and you, so Hans Christensen wrote this great report in 1996 on U.S. war plans, and I'm trying to understand what's behind the U.S. force development in these ways. And my personal sense is that it sounds reasonable. We want a full spectrum of options for a president in a difficult crisis. You want conventional options, you want the big nuclear options, and I think what they want is something in between, the small nuclear options. And why do you want all of them? You want conventional options because you can probably get the forces, and it's less likely to lead to Chinese nuclear retaliation is the hope. You want the big nuclear ones because those will get the targets, and they might want something in between the small nuclear ones that probably won't kill many people in China on the ground. You might be able to have interwar deterrence, and you'll be more likely to get them than the conventional. Which do we want? I think we want them all. But you're right, we didn't look at conventional. I think that means that we understate our capabilities. Philip's question, I got your question. Sorry we didn't answer it the first time. It is possible. We haven't thought about this yet. Philip's basically saying maybe the Russian deterrent or the Soviet deterrent had big effects on U.S. policy other than what we looked at. Absolutely, it's possible. We've thought about this. We don't have any good ways of approaching it yet. Maybe your dissertation does. But if you build nuclear weapons for one reason, only one reason, it's presumably to prevent an adversary from intentionally using nuclear weapons on your territory. That's the most important thing you might want to achieve out of your nuclear weapons. And our point is that doesn't get achieved until higher up the scale. Maybe we were nicer in the negotiations over Turkey, or we didn't do things in Ethiopia that we otherwise would have. It's possible. They might have got something out of it. The very last thing, it's on the arms control point. I think arms control has had a bunch of effects, some of them foreseen and intentional and helpful, and some of them unforeseen. So a variety of effects have to do with, I won't be the one to stand and make it. I think arms control has had some helpful effects in building trust and mutual cooperation and avoiding some accidents in the later stage of the Cold War. That said, it's also had other effects, like it's made sure that the United States and Russia really know where each other's strategic systems are, which could be harmful in some circumstances. But I only mean that half seriously. It's also had some seriously harmful effects to the strategic balance. So the United States toward the end of the Cold War busted the Russians building this Krasnoyarsk radar, and the Krasnoyarsk radar, my recollection is because of its location, its orientation, it was technically a violation of the ABM treaty. And we kept hammering them about this. You're violating the treaty, they're violating the treaty. And finally they said, okay, we'll dismantle it. They dismantle it. Success of arms control. Of course, what this did is it left a gaping hole in their early warning network, and they were therefore blind for the next 20 years, and might still be today, to a submarine-launched missile launch. And my understanding is what we promised the Russians in exchange for them dismantling Krasnoyarsk is we said, if you'll come in line with the treaty, we will promise you we will not increase the number of submarines in the Pacific, i.e. to exploit that hole, and number two is we will not upgrade the accuracy of the missiles in the Pacific submarine fleet. Of course, they dismantled Krasnoyarsk because of arms control. We then shifted now 2/3 of our submarines to the Pacific, loaded them all with DF5s, DF5s, and then to boot, then we pulled out of the arms control deal. D5s, that's right, D5s.
There's a DF5.
Yeah, right. So arms control has worked on both sides here. In some cases, we've used it to reduce tensions. In other cases, we've used it skillfully to build up vulnerabilities in the adversary.
Keir, you said you didn't want to end on that point. Is there a different point
No,
you'd
no,
like to end on?
No,
All
I'll
right.
end on that.
Well,
I share his views.
Then join me
He
in
shares my
thanking
views. I share Keir's
Professors Lieber and Tilman.